Hi, everyone. My name is KatelynDurst, and I am an MA candidate at Eastern University in Urban Studies with a concept. My thesis project is called From Manipulable Objects to Self-Empowered Subjects, Radical Self-Care for Black Women. And so to provide kind of a pathway for the topics that we will be discussing tonight, here is an outline of those topics. First, I will set intentions, which I believe are important to the radical self-care process. Then I will move on to defining radical self-care for Black women. And then I will go about sharing the research that came out of the literature review for this project, all the subjects of interest. And then I will end with a poetry reading from the zine, which I created for my thesis, community arts project, which is called Radical Self-Care for Black Women, a poetry zine. So I'm going to begin with intention setting, which, as I mentioned before, is a very important part of radical self-care. It provides a foundation from which you can manifest what you hope for. And because this research is coming from a place that involves so much trauma, it's important to put forth a light of hope. And so a reading of intentions from my poetry zine. I would invite anyone who's watching this, if you're comfortable, to take a deep breath in and out. I invite you to close your eyes, continue deep breathing as I read these intentions. I set an energy of safety around my body. I set an energy to express myself whenever and wherever. I go boldly and thoughtfully into the threshold of opportunity. What I know now is enough, and my spirit and body can rest. My strength is in season, and bravery is blossoming. I do not dwell in emotional deserts. I dwell in the wellspring of life, a joyful waterfall of blessings. I listen to my feelings and anxieties, but I do not let them guide me to anything but the light. I acknowledge that receiving light also comes with a passageway through the darkness. I create poems and art pieces that are victory roars over spiritual, emotional, mental, and social oppression. I inspire and guide others into spaces of rejuvenation, celebration, safety, and love. I run towards home with open arms and a steady, beautiful heart. So now that we have set our intentions, we can move forward into what radical self-care really means for Black women. So radical self-care is a self-care that radically decolonizes the mind from cultural trauma and societal expectations. It is radical when the self-care restores the self in a society that does not care for the self. It is radical when that self-care occurs in a society where Black women are only treated as servants to everyone but herself. Radical self-care for Black women is not an extremist claim. An etymological study of the word radical shows something completely different. The word radical comes from the Latin definition in the 14th century of radicalis, which means having roots. The meaning of the word radix actually is defined as root. Another interpretation could be going to the origin, finding the essential. Because of those definitions, radical form of self-care for Black women could be described as going to the origin of self or the root of self to learn how to take care of and for yourself. Another really great quote from Ella Baker on creating radical change in our society and our communities is, in order for us poor and oppressed people to become part of the society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means that we are going to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in the original meaning getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So these are the means by which we can change that system. The research share out, which I will share with you, which includes the following subjects: Black feminisms, mistreatment and traumas on the Black female bodies, poetry on trauma and radical self-care by Black women, and then radical self-care practices for Black women. So to begin, we'll talk a little bit about Black feminisms. In 1863, Alice Cooper gave a speech where she talked about Black females in society being basically constantly given both the woman question and the race problem. Though 1863 was quite a long time ago, it still is a persistent juggling of two different identities: double consciousness, double jeopardy. A form of Black feminism, a definition of Black feminism, comes from Black feminist thought, which says that Black feminism is a school of thought, stating that sexism, class oppression, gender identity, and racism are inextricably bound together. I thought it was very important, on top of that, to kind of coin it not just as Black feminism, but Black feminisms, because I wanted to provide an intersectional, inclusive understanding of what Black feminism is, which lends to all different types of women and femme experiences within the Black community. Some midwives of Black feminism thought, which were really important to this study, included Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and the Combahee River Collective. Some really important quotes that came out of those people and collectives were first from Audre Lorde, who said, "We are not here as women examining racism in a political and social vacuum. We operate in the teeth of a system for which racism and sexism are primary, established, and necessary props of profit." Another quote which came out of this was by Bell Hooks, when she said, "Black men advance in all spheres of American life. They encourage Black women to assume a more subservient role. Gradually, the radical revolutionary spirit that had characterized the intellectual and political contribution of Black women in the 19th century was quelled." And finally, the Combahee River Collective was built on the observation of Black feminism by continuing to analyze the roots of Black women's oppression under capitalism and arguing for the reorganization of society based on the collective needs of the most oppressed. That is to say, if you could free the most oppressed person in society, then you would have to free everyone. The most oppressed person in society, of course, being Black women. And all these thoughts are important. They're all valid to the study because they kind of bring foundation and understanding into why Black women especially needed to form their own ownership over their own identity, and kind of like advocate for themselves, because they were not included in the feminism movements. They were not included in a lot of the women's rights, voters' rights movements, and so they started their own collectives and started talking to groups of Black women specifically. And so that's basically where the research is founded on, because it provides a great kind of lens into where radical self-care can come from, basically Black feminism, understanding and valuing yourself as a Black woman and what that means in our society. So the next slide is talking about mistreatments and traumas committed on the Black female body. This is very difficult, very hard stuff to talk about. My heart always beats super fast, both when I was writing this section, and also just now as I'm sharing it with you, because trauma is indeed in the body. Cultural trauma is kind of what we'll be talking about today with this area. It occurs when members of a collectivity feel that they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, making their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Another definition is from post-traumatic slave syndrome, which describes a set of behaviors, beliefs, and sections associated with or related to multi-generational trauma experienced by African Americans that included but are not limited to undiagnosed and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder in enslaved Africans and their descendants. So, with those lenses in mind, we can talk about the people who perpetrated some of these mistreatments and traumas on Black female bodies. First person I want to talk about is James Marion Sims, who is immortalized at many universities and hospitals and known as the father of modern genealogy. Famously began his work with enslaved Black women, whom he blamed for high death rates and their infant children. He ascribed neonatal tetanus to a mother's moral and intellectual failures. He was kind of the author of, I don't know, like the welfare queen idea, which basically believed that Black women are inherently horrible mothers and lazy and are only able to basically produce fatal lives. Sims went on to acquire 11 Black slave women to do a type of vaginal surgery. He did that as research without their consent, and used other assistant physicians so that he could basically go on to use this research to cure an ailment called vesical vaginal fistula in white women, and he would not do the same surgical process he did on Black women. That was just the trial run. So the surgeries themselves were terribly painful. Not only had Sims come too close to unnatural openings of the ravaged vaginal tissues, he had to make edges of these openings knit together. He opted to abrade or scarify the edges of the vaginal tears every time he attempted to repair an opening. He then closed them with sutures and sawed them together, but they would become infected and reopen painfully every time. So very difficult to talk about. Another medical, basically, philosophy and phenomena kind of reared its ugly head in the 20th century called eugenics, which comes from the Greek word eugenes, which means basically well-born. Thomas Galton used eugenics to basically select procreation to refine the human race while conquering social dysfunction. He believed that we could use basically like medical technology and information to cure the disease of social ill and also promote good, healthy, and beautiful traits, which supposedly came from wealthy class. Another person who was basically a heroine of eugenics was a feminist, socialist, and popularizer of the birth control pill and Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. She wrote very powerful things and was well loved within the feminist movement, but shifted her mission to advocate for eugenics. She was a part of a project called the Negro Project, which supported eugenic ideas of perpetrating Black stereotypes in an effort to control and reduce African American fertility. One of her writings profiled a family case history that described eugenic problems of Black families, which presented basically a feeble-minded girl in her 20s who was unable to be a mother. And so in the 1930s, she began to create these basically clinics where forced sterilization of Black women occurred. By 1983, 43% of the women who had been sterilized through government-funded programs were African American women. Another eugenic birth control tactic arose in the 90s called Norplant, which suppresses ovulation. It was tested and developed on poor women of color abroad. And since then, Planned Parenthood has noted that over 1 million women in the US have used it, majority of whom were poor African American women in public and low-income clinics. Another thing that has been perpetrated is forced surrogacy. It is important to note that Black women historically have never had ownership over their own reproduction, which is indeed an injustice and a crime. It's important to know that in slave times, African slave women were used for sexual pleasure. Basically, antebellum women, white women, were too pure for that. They only participated in sex to basically reproduce, and so white male slave owners would seek out Black women to rape them for sexual pleasure. And this is kind of where also slave owners would basically use their privilege to force Black women, force slave women to mate with other slaves so that they could have offspring, because legally any offspring that was born to a slave woman was also a slave. And so it was to that slave owner's profit to have as many children being born as possible. Unfortunately, medical racism still exists today. There are a lot of racist, sexualized mistreatments toward African American female bodies. Right now, Black infants in America are twice more likely to die than white infants. And the US is one of 13 countries in the world where maternal mortality, the death of women related to pregnancy and childbirth, has gone up in the last 25 years. And that number has gone up within Black women. So it's a lot. Of course, poetry on trauma and self-care by Black women is super essential, super powerful, and relevant, especially in light of all the traumas of the past and lived experiences of Black women. Here's one poem that is very beautiful by Eve L. Ewing, who is a sociologist, poet, and also comic book writer. Basically, I'll read it. So it is written, heal yourself, baby, with the tree and the touch, with the turmeric. In this world, nothing brittle prevails. So in this world, grease is a compliment. No, it's a weapon. No, it's a dream you had where it was cold. And your mother, seeing the threat of gray on your elbows, and knowing that ash is the language of the dead, knelt and put her hands on your face like this, and anointed you a protected child, a hot iron in a place of frost. Recall this, and fear no thickness, be resurrected, glistening the story of you, be shining. This poem reads very much like a ritual. It's very much a self-care ritual. It comes off as something that was passed down from generations. You see a mother anointing her child it's about shea butter, and so it's with shea butter. It's not only about self-care as a ritual, but self-care as weapon, basically to combat oppression. So this is a very important part of the study because I'm a poet, and I wrote a book of poetry, a zine of poetry, on the topic of radical self-care. So I wanted to include Black poets, Black female poets who also wrote about self-care and overcoming trauma. And this poem is an excellent form of that because it basically says that despite the cold, despite the winter, there's hope, there's life, there's resurrection. Even in something as simple as shea butter. which is also a ritual that was passed down from the African continent. So radical self-care practices for Black women, very important. There's a lot out there when it comes to what that looks like. Mental health for Black women is super important because of compounded oppressions of racism, sexism, as well as lived experiences of trauma, of depression, of anxiety. One of the roots of mental illness is invariably an interlocking system of lies we have been told and we have told ourselves. Commitment to truth-telling is thus the first step in any process to self-recovery. Bell Hooks said that truth-telling is really important. One way we can tell ourselves the truth is through meditation, through intention settings, like I did earlier, meditation, yoga, baths. They're all forms of basically just slowing the mind and centering the self, thinking of your body, putting your body first, not being aware of what society says you should be doing, but just be in the moment and be in the moment with your body and what's coming up in your body. Taking time, taking breath, taking a moment. They're all really great ways to basically like not only release trauma in your mind, but also release trauma in your body. Your body holds a lot of trauma. And so the idea of meditation and breathing and yoga really like lets that out through both practices of actual movement and actual time and breath. Bathing is one of my favorite self-care rituals, and it's not only a nice way to get clean, but water is very healing. Soaking in Epsom salts is very healing. Salt literally extracts things from your body. It's taking that time, taking that breath, putting essential oils in a bath is just like a really beautiful practice, a sacred practice of really just being with yourself and remembering yourself. That's really what radical is returning to the roots of who you are, maybe who you are before you knew about oppression or before you experienced trauma. And so radical self-care, super, super important. I want to end with a poem, which poetry is another form of radical self-care, which I have personally been implementing in my life for a very long time. The poetry zine, which I have written, I have a copy here in the flesh, already dog-eared, has a lot of self-portrait poems. Self-portrait poems are really important kind of poem that really allows you to take a look at yourself in a metaphoric way. And so the poem I want to read for you is called Self-Portrait as Garden. I want to have it on the screen so you can see the form. In my hair, the fruit from yesterday's seed, eternal golden globes and harvests. Because of her bravery, I can feast on the juice. Somewhere there is a garden during this whole life, as I dug deep inside to reach the green thing that fires up wild palms in the desert. I have never felt this way before, both born and wan, but not in the way that someone dies. There's a story of buried stone fruit glory within me, and it was in season, purple flesh, for the remedy to pain. Your mother planted you for a reason, and you almost found her. In the winter, offer the blessing of water. When days grow long, you can stretch roots into darkness, the mystic black within you, and thrust the fruit into light. Bathe in it over and over again. Amen. In my hair, the fruits from yesterday's seed. I have never felt this way before, both born, eternal golden globes and harvest and wan, but not in the way that someone dies. Because of her bravery, there's a story of buried stone fruit glory. I can feast on the juice within me, and it was in season. Purple flesh, somewhere there is a garden for the remedy to pain. Your mother planted during this whole life as I dug deep inside you for a reason, and you almost found her. She reached the green thing in the winter, offer the blessing of water that fires up wild palms in the desert, When days grow long, you can stretch roots into darkness, the mystic black within you, and thrust the fruit into light. Bathe it in over and over again. Amen. Finally, I want to leave you with this offering from Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Ashe.